Sarah's life was built around routine and responsibility. As a middle school teacher in small-town Texas, she was known for her commitment to her students and her community. But her busy life often left little room for personal reflection. While she attended church sporadically, her faith felt like an obligation rather than a source of comfort. Life was full, Sarah would later recount, but my heart was empty. Her days were consumed by grading papers, managing her daughter's soccer schedule, and trying to be a good wife to her husband, Mark. Sarah prided herself on being self-sufficient, often brushing aside thoughts of God and eternity. Faith, she believed, was something reserved for Sunday mornings and holiday prayers. But everything changed one spring morning. As Sarah taught her 7th grade class, an unbearable pain shot through her chest. Within moments, she collapsed in front of her students, her heart giving way to a massive attack. Little did she know, her journey was just beginning. If you've ever wondered about the afterlife or had a powerful spiritual experience, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I died and met Jesus. It started as a normal day. I was standing in front of my 7th grade history class, talking about the Alamo, my favorite lesson to teach. My students were restless, as they often were during springtime, but I'd managed to keep their attention with a mix of humor and firm reminders to stay on task. Everything felt fine, until it didn't. It started with a dull ache in my chest, something I thought was just stress. I'd been working late nights, grading papers, and juggling my daughter Emma's soccer schedule. But within seconds, the ache became a crushing pain. It felt like an invisible hand was squeezing the life out of me. I gasped and grabbed the edge of my desk, trying to stay upright. "Mrs. Smith, are you okay?" I heard one of my students ask, but their voice felt distant. My vision blurred, and my legs gave out beneath me. The last thing I remember was the sound of their screams as I hit the floor. Then everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in my classroom. I wasn't in any place I'd ever seen before. I was standing in a meadow that radiated light, not sunlight, but something softer, more alive. The colors around me were more vibrant than anything I'd ever seen. Flowers swayed gently in a breeze I couldn't feel, and the air was filled with music, though there were no instruments or voices. I knew, deep in my soul, that I wasn't on Earth anymore. But it wasn't the beauty of the place that overwhelmed me. It was the presence. It was as if love itself had taken form and wrapped itself around me. I turned, and that's when I saw him, Jesus. He wasn't an image or a painting like I'd seen in church. He was real, standing there with a presence so powerful that I couldn't look away. His eyes were unlike anything I'd ever seen, piercing, yet filled with a love so pure that it made me feel completely exposed and yet completely safe at the same time. I fell to my knees. I wasn't worthy to stand in his presence. Memories flashed through my mind, the good I'd done, the selfish choices I'd made, the times I'd ignored him and brushed aside faith as unimportant. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "I'm not worthy." Jesus stepped closer and reached out his hand. When he touched my shoulder, I felt a wave of peace wash over me. He smiled, and his words were simple but profound. "You are mine." In that moment, every fear, every regret, every doubt melted away. I was overwhelmed by a love so deep that it felt like it could heal every broken part of me. I didn't want to leave, but then something began to pull at me, like an invisible thread tugging me back. "No," I cried out. "Please, I don't want to go." Jesus looked at me with compassion. "It's not your time," he said. "You have more to do." Before I could ask what he meant, the light around me began to fade. The meadow disappeared, and I was plunged back into darkness. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. The room was stark, filled with the beeping of machines and the worried faces of doctors and nurses. My chest felt heavy, like a weight was pressing down on it. "You're lucky to be alive," Dr. Patel told me. "Your heart stopped for 6 minutes." But I didn't feel lucky. I felt changed. I had seen Jesus. I had felt his love, and he had sent me back with a purpose, though I didn't yet know what it was. As tears ran down my face, I whispered to myself, I met Jesus, and he told me I wasn't done yet. When I woke up in the hospital, I was surrounded by machines, wires, and the sharp scent of antiseptic. My body felt heavy, as though the weight of the world had been piled onto my chest. Dr. Patel leaned over me, his voice calm but firm as he explained what had happened. A heart attack, a massive one. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, his tone clinical. "Your heart stopped for 6 minutes, but we were able to bring you back." Lucky. That word didn't feel right. What I'd experienced wasn't luck. It was something far greater, something beyond human understanding. I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of it all. The vision of the meadow and the face of Jesus were as vivid as if I were still there. His words echoed in my mind, "You have more to do." But what did he mean? My purpose had always been clear: teach my students, care for my family, go through the motions of life. Now, none of that seemed enough. Mark arrived shortly after, his face pale and strained. He squeezed my hand tightly, his voice breaking as he said, "I thought I lost you." I wanted to tell him everything, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain what had happened? Would he even believe me? Instead, I managed a weak smile and said, "I'm still here." The days that followed were a blur of tests, recovery, and restless thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jesus. The memory of his presence brought me peace, but it also stirred a deep restlessness in my soul. "You have more to do." I couldn't shake those words. They haunted me, pressing on my heart like a weight I didn't know how to carry. One afternoon, after the doctors finally cleared me to return home, Mark drove me back to our small house. Emma was waiting for me at the door, her eyes red from crying. She threw her arms around me and whispered, "I was so scared, Mom." I held her tightly, feeling a pang of guilt. I'd always been so caught up in my work and responsibilities that I hadn't realized how much she needed me, how much I'd been absent in her life, even when I was physically there. That evening, as I lay in bed, I decided to pray. It had been years since I'd spoken to God with any real conviction. My prayers had always been rehearsed, obligatory, a habit I'd kept up more for appearances than faith. But this time, I poured my heart out. "God," I whispered, "I don't understand why you sent me back. I don't know what you want from me. Please, show me." The next day, I decided to share my experience with my best friend, Jessica. She was a fellow teacher and the only person I trusted with something so deeply personal. We met at a quiet coffee shop, and as soon as I sat down, she grabbed my hands and said, "Sarah, you look different, lighter. What happened to you?" I took a deep breath and began to tell her everything: the pain, the darkness, the meadow, and seeing Jesus. As I spoke, tears streamed down my face, but Jessica didn't interrupt. She just listened, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and disbelief. When I finished, she was silent for a moment, then said softly, "Sarah, do you think he's calling you to something, like a second chance?" Her words struck a chord deep within me. That's exactly what it felt like. A second chance, but one I didn't fully understand. Over the following days, I began noticing things I hadn't before. The struggles of my students, the sadness in Emma's eyes, the way Mark seemed distant even as he cared for me. My heart ached with a new awareness, as if Jesus' love had opened my eyes to the needs of those around me. Still, I wrestled with doubt. What if I'd imagined the whole thing? What if it was just a dream, a trick of my oxygen-starved brain? But every time I thought about his face, his voice, I felt a warmth that swept away my fears. I wasn't the same person who had walked into that classroom. Something had shifted inside me, and I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The weeks after my recovery were a whirlwind of emotions. I returned to teaching, but nothing felt the same. My classroom, once a place of passion and purpose, now felt hollow. The students' chatter, the shuffle of papers, it all seemed distant, like I was watching my life unfold from the outside. One afternoon, I stayed late to grade papers, hoping the familiar routine would ground me. As I sat at my desk, flipping through essays, a knock on the door startled me. It was Lisa, one of my quieter students, standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Mrs. Smith," she said softly, her voice barely audible, "can I talk to you?" I motioned her in, and she sat down across from me, wringing her hands. "I don't know how to say this," she began, "but something's been wrong at home, and I don't know who else to tell." Her words hit me like a lightning bolt. Lisa had always been shy, but her eyes carried a depth of pain I hadn't noticed before. She told me about her parents' constant fighting, the nights she spent hiding in her room, the fear that things would never get better. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face and mine. I felt a strange, almost physical pull in my chest, as if Jesus himself were urging me to pay attention. "This is why you're here," the thought echoed in my mind. I reached across the desk and took her hands in mine. "Lisa," I said gently, "you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here for you." After she left, I sat in silence, replaying the conversation over and over. That's when it hit me. My near-death experience wasn't just about me. It wasn't just a personal encounter with Jesus. It was a call to action, a command to love and serve others with the same compassion I had felt in his presence. The next revelation came a few nights later. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I decided to open my Bible. It had been years since I'd read it seriously. The pages were stiff, the binding unyielding, but I flipped through until I landed on a verse that seemed to leap off the page. "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Matthew 25:40. I stared at the words, my heart pounding. It wasn't just Lisa, it was everyone. My students, my family, the people I passed on the street. Each one was a reflection of Jesus, a chance to live out his love. That night, I prayed again, not out of desperation, but with a new sense of clarity. "Jesus," I whispered, "I see it now. I understand. Use me. Show me how to be what you want me to be." The next day, I woke up with a strange mix of fear and excitement. I didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time in my life, I was ready to follow. The morning after my prayer, I woke up feeling lighter, yet deeply aware that something had shifted. My family, however, didn't notice the change right away. They were just relieved that I was home and recovering. Mark, ever the pragmatic one, resumed his quiet vigilance. He was supportive but cautious, keeping his focus on my health. Emma, on the other hand, seemed more attentive. She'd linger at the table after dinner, asking how my day had gone or sharing bits of hers. It was subtle, but I could tell she was testing the waters, trying to figure out if her mother's near-death experience had made her a different person. The truth was, I was different, though I wasn't sure how to explain it. One evening, a few days after my talk with Lisa, Mark brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me on the couch. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I've just been thinking a lot," I said finally. "About life, about what really matters." He nodded, his brow furrowing. "That's normal after what you've been through. It's a lot to process." I wanted to tell him about Jesus, about the meadow, about the overwhelming love I'd felt, but a part of me was afraid. What if he thought I'd lost my mind? What if he dismissed it as a hallucination? Instead, I just said, "I think I'm supposed to do more, Mark. I feel like I've been given a second chance for a reason." He reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "Whatever you need, I'm here," he said, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Emma's reaction came a few days later. She was sitting at the kitchen table, working on a school project, when she suddenly looked up and said, "Mom, do you believe in heaven?" The question caught me off guard. I put down the dish I was drying and sat across from her. "I do," I said carefully. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know. It's just, you were gone for a while. The doctors said your heart stopped. Did you see anything?" Her voice was tentative, but her eyes were filled with curiosity and fear. I took a deep breath. "Yes," I said. "I saw something. I saw Jesus." Her eyes widened. "Really?" I nodded, and for the first time I told her everything. The meadow, the music, his words. She listened intently, her expression shifting from disbelief to wonder. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Do you think he's real?" she asked finally. "I know he's real," I said. "And I know he loves you, Emma, more than you can imagine." She didn't say anything else, but later that night I found her sitting on her bed with her Bible open, a book I hadn't seen her touch in years. At school, my newfound purpose was becoming clearer. Lisa wasn't the only student struggling. It seemed like everywhere I turned, there were kids dealing with broken homes, insecurities, and questions they were too afraid to ask. I started paying closer attention, reaching out, letting them know I was there. But not everyone understood my change. Jessica, who had initially been so supportive, began to pull back when I started talking about Jesus more openly. "I'm happy for you, Sarah," she said one afternoon, "but don't you think you're taking this a little far? Not everyone is religious, you know." Her words stung, but I couldn't let them deter me. I wasn't trying to preach, I was just trying to love. Mark remained cautiously supportive, but I could tell he didn't fully grasp the depth of what I'd experienced. Emma, on the other hand, was beginning to open up. She started asking more questions about God, about faith, about life. For the first time, I felt like I was truly living, not just existing. And even though I didn't have all the answers, I knew one thing for sure: this journey wasn't just mine. It was for everyone around me. The weeks following my return to teaching were anything but smooth. My heart felt alive with purpose, but that clarity only made me more aware of the struggles unfolding around me. At school, at home, and even within myself, the challenges seemed to multiply. One of the first hurdles came when Lisa's parents were called in for a conference. I had been keeping an eye on Lisa, noticing her exhaustion and her quiet withdrawal, but I knew I couldn't help her alone. After a particularly rough day, I called her parents in to discuss what she'd shared with me. When they arrived, I was met with a wall of resistance. Her father sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, while her mother avoided my gaze entirely. "I don't understand why this is necessary," her father said. "Lisa's fine. She's just a teenager, always dramatic about something." "Lisa confided in me because she's scared," I said gently. "She's struggling, and I think she needs more support at home." His face hardened. "We don't need anyone telling us how to raise our daughter." I felt the sting of his words but kept my composure. "I'm not here to judge," I said. "I just want to make sure Lisa feels safe and supported." The meeting ended tensely, and though her mother gave me a small nod as they left, I wasn't sure if anything would change. The encounter left me shaken. How could I help Lisa if her own parents didn't seem to care? At home, things were equally challenging. Emma had started attending youth group at a local church, a decision that thrilled me, but it sparked tension with Mark. One evening, as Emma was getting ready to go, Mark pulled me aside. "Is this really necessary?" he asked. "She's just a kid. Let her figure this stuff out when she's older." "She's asking questions now," I said, "and she's searching for answers. Isn't that a good thing?" Mark shook his head, his frustration evident. "I don't know, Sarah. Ever since your experience, it feels like everything is about religion. What happened to just being normal?" His words cut deep. I wanted to explain that this wasn't about religion. It was about a relationship, about finding meaning and purpose. But I could see that he wasn't ready to hear that. The strain between us grew in the following days. Mark wasn't openly hostile, but his distance was palpable. He threw himself into work, leaving early and coming home late, and our conversations became increasingly surface level. Even at school, I started to face resistance. A few colleagues began to question the changes they saw in me. One teacher, Mrs. Cooper, pulled me aside in the staff room. "Sarah," she said, her voice low, "I heard you've been talking to students about faith. Be careful. This is a public school, and not everyone is going to appreciate that." I wanted to argue, to tell her that I wasn't preaching, just listening and sharing when asked, but I could see the warning in her eyes. That night, I knelt beside my bed, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. "God," I prayed, "I don't know how to do this. I feel like I'm failing, at home, at work, with everything. Please, show me the way." In the stillness that followed, a thought came to me, quiet but unmistakable. Lean not alone. The next morning, I woke up with renewed determination. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to give up. Lisa, Emma, my marriage, none of it was beyond hope. If Jesus had brought me back, he wouldn't leave me to face these challenges alone. Life felt like a tightrope walk. Every day I balanced the demands of my newfound faith, my relationships, and my own doubts. The weight of it all began to press harder, especially in my home. Mark's distance gnawed at me. He wasn't unkind, but his indifference felt colder than any argument could have. One evening, after another dinner where our conversation barely scratched the surface, I decided to confront him. As I cleared the table, I turned to him. "Mark, can we talk?" He hesitated, then nodded, sitting back down at the table. I joined him, folding my hands to stop them from shaking. "I feel like something's changed between us," I said carefully, "and I don't want us to drift apart." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sarah, I'm trying. I really am. But I don't know how to connect with you right now. You've been through something huge, and I don't understand it." "Then ask me." I said, my voice breaking. Please let me share this with you. He looked at me, his eyes filled with both love and frustration. I'm scared, Sarah. Scared that you're becoming someone I don't recognize. His words hit me harder than I expected. I reached across the table and took his hand. I'm still me, Mark, but I've changed because I've seen something, I've felt something that's too big to ignore. I don't want to lose you in this. We sat in silence for a while, holding hands. It wasn't a resolution, but it felt like a step forward. At school, the complexity of my students' lives continued to pull at my heart. Lisa's situation hadn't improved, and I could see the weight she carried in her slumped shoulders and tired eyes. One day after class, I found her sitting alone in the hallway, staring at her phone. Lisa, are you okay? I asked, sitting down beside her. She shrugged, not looking up. My parents are fighting again. I hate going home. I wanted to say the perfect thing, to make her feel safe and valued. Instead, I asked, have you ever prayed about it? She looked at me, surprised. I don't think that would help. Maybe it would, I said gently. It doesn't have to be fancy. Just tell God how you're feeling. He's listening, even when it feels like no one else is. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, tucking her phone into her pocket. It was a small moment, but I felt a glimmer of hope. Emma, too, was navigating her own struggles. One night, she came to my room, her face pale. Mom, she whispered, can I talk to you? Of course, I said, sitting up and patting the bed beside me. She climbed in, clutching her pillow. Some of the girls at school found out I've been going to youth group. They started making fun of me, saying I'm trying to be holier than everyone else. My heart ached for her. I'm so sorry, sweetie, I said. That's not fair. I just don't know if I can keep going, she said, tears spilling over. It's hard, Mom. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tightly. It is hard, I admitted, but sometimes the hardest things are the most important. Remember, you're not alone. Jesus is with you, and so am I. That night, as Emma slept beside me, I realized how much courage it took to stand firm in faith, especially as a teenager. Her struggles mirrored my own, and I prayed for strength for both of us. Even among my colleagues, tension was building. Jessica, my closest friend at work, seemed to be avoiding me. One afternoon, I caught up with her in the parking lot. Hey, Jess, I said, have I done something to upset you? She hesitated, then sighed. It's not you, Sarah. It's just, you're different now, and it's hard for me to relate. Her honesty stung, but I appreciated it. I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable, I said. But this is who I am now. I hope we can still be friends. She gave me a small smile. I'll try. As I drove home that evening, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. Mark, Emma, Lisa, Jessica. It was overwhelming, but in the midst of it all, I felt a quiet reassurance. You're not alone. Keep going. That night, I prayed harder than ever, asking for guidance, for strength, and for the courage to keep walking this path. The days that followed felt like walking through a storm. My relationships were fraying at the edges, and the weight of my transformation became harder to carry alone. But just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, something unexpected happened, a moment that changed everything. It started with a phone call from Emma's school. I was sitting at my desk, grading papers, when my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed it was the school principal. I immediately felt a knot form in my stomach. Hello, Sarah? Principal Montgomery's voice was tight, strained. I'm afraid Emma's had a bit of an incident. I think it would be best if you came down here. My heart raced. I grabbed my keys and rushed to the school, dread gnawing at my insides. When I arrived, Emma was sitting in the principal's office, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes red from crying. Emma? I asked softly, kneeling in front of her. What happened? Her lower lip quivered, but she didn't speak. Principal Montgomery cleared his throat. There was a confrontation. Emma's been called names by several of the other students. They mocked her for going to youth group and made some hurtful comments about her faith. My stomach sank. I'm so sorry, sweetie, I said, reaching for her hand. It's not just that, Emma finally whispered. It's what they said about you, about how you're brainwashed and how you're trying to make me just like you. The words hit me like a punch in the chest. I knew there had been tension at school, but hearing that my daughter was being hurt because of me, because of my newfound faith, was unbearable. I held her hand tighter, trying to keep my voice steady. Emma, listen to me. What they're saying isn't true. You know who you are and you know what you believe. Don't let anyone take that away from you." She nodded, but the pain in her eyes didn't fade. I could feel the tension growing between us, and I knew this wasn't just about high school gossip. Emma was struggling, torn between her faith and the pressure to fit in. At home, Mark's mood had only worsened. He was still distant, but now there was an edge to his silence. One night, after we'd finished dinner, I couldn't take it anymore. "Mark, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. He looked at me, his expression weary. "We talk all the time, Sarah. What do you want to talk about now?" I took a deep breath. About us, about our family, about what I've been going through. He pushed his plate away, leaning back in his chair. "What's there to talk about? I've heard it all. You've found your new purpose, and you've thrown yourself into it. But I'm still here, Sarah, and I'm not sure where I fit into this new version of you." His words were sharp, but they carried an undercurrent of fear that he was losing me. I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. "I'm still me, Mark, but I've seen something, and I can't ignore it. It's not about religion, it's about Jesus. He changed everything for me." He shook his head, standing up and pacing the room. "I don't know what you want from me, Sarah. You keep talking about this Jesus, and all I see is you drifting further away from me." I stood up too, unable to hide the frustration in my voice. "I'm not drifting away from you, but I can't go back to who I was. I've seen the truth, Mark, and I need you to see it too." "I don't want to see it," he snapped. "I want my wife back, the one who wasn't so obsessed with all of this." His words cut deep, but I couldn't let them break me. "I can't pretend, Mark. I can't go back to being someone I'm not. I'm asking you to see the person I've become, to accept it, even if it's hard." He turned away, his back to me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I don't know if I can." The words hung in the air like a cold wind. I felt the walls closing in around me, the weight of my choices settling in. I was caught between two worlds, the world I knew before, my near-death experience, and the one I was still learning to embrace. But then, something else happened, something that lifted the weight of it all, if only for a moment. The next day, as I was driving to school, a familiar face appeared at the crosswalk. It was Lisa, looking lost and broken as she walked, head down, her shoulders hunched. Without thinking, I pulled over. "Lisa?" I called, rolling down the window. She looked up, surprised, then slowly walked toward me. "Are you okay?" I asked, concern filling my voice. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what to do anymore. Everything feels so empty." Without a second thought, I opened the door and gestured for her to sit beside me. "Come on, let's talk." As we drove to a nearby park, I felt a strange peace settle over me. Despite everything, despite Mark's rejection, the pressure at home, and the isolation I sometimes felt, I knew in my heart that I was exactly where I needed to be. The road ahead wasn't clear, but the journey had begun, and I wasn't walking it alone. The days after my encounter with Lisa felt strangely quiet. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break free. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that my spiritual journey was reaching a point where everything would change. At home, the tension with Mark continued to simmer. Each conversation felt like we were speaking different languages. Me, trying to explain the deep spiritual transformation I was experiencing, and him, holding on to what was familiar. He loved me, I knew that, but the strain of watching me shift into someone he didn't quite recognize was suffocating for both of us. One evening, after putting Emma to bed, I sat down with him in the living room. "Mark," I began, my voice soft but firm, "I can't pretend this is easy, for either of us, but I need to know if there's any part of you that's willing to understand where I'm coming from." He sighed deeply, rubbing his face. "Sarah, I want to understand. I really do, but it feels like you're slipping away from me. You're so focused on this faith, and I don't know how to keep up. It's like there's a wall between us now." I could feel the heartbreak in his words. It mirrored my own pain. I hadn't wanted to drift apart from him, but everything about my life felt so deeply intertwined with the truth I had found. I didn't know how to be the person I was before. "I'm still here, Mark. I'm still the same person, but I'm learning to walk in faith, and that's not something I can do alone. I need you beside me, even if you're not where I am yet." He looked at me, the frustration in his eyes now mixing with something else, something softer. "I don't know if I can be who you need me to be," he whispered. I didn't know if that was something we could fix, but I wasn't ready to give up on us, and I wasn't willing to go back to who I was before I met Jesus. But as my own faith deepened, I began to notice something new, something powerful stirring around me. At school, my students had become more curious about my beliefs. Lisa was still struggling, but she seemed more open to hearing about the hope I had found. One afternoon, as I was going over lesson plans in my classroom, Lisa knocked on the door. "Can I talk to you, Mrs. Green?" she asked, her voice small. "Of course, Lisa," I said, motioning for her to sit. She hesitated before speaking, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I've been thinking about what you said, about praying and asking God for help. I don't know, it just feels like everything is falling apart, and I don't know how to keep going." I leaned forward, my heart aching for her. "I understand, Lisa, but I want you to know something. You don't have to have it all figured out. Just take it one step at a time. God will meet you where you are." She nodded, but I could see the confusion still clouding her expression. "Do you really think it's that simple?" she asked, a hint of skepticism in her voice. I smiled gently, my voice soft but sure. "It's not always easy, but it is simple. God loves you, Lisa. Even when it feels like everything is falling apart, He's there. I promise you, you're not alone." Her eyes welled up with tears. "I'm scared, Mrs. Green. What if nothing changes?" "Sometimes it takes time," I said quietly. "But don't give up. There's a peace that comes when you know you're not carrying it all alone." I could see her struggling with the idea, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. Later that week, I ran into Jessica at the grocery store. She looked just as tired as I felt, and when our eyes met, I saw something in her expression, something more than just exhaustion. "Hey, Jess," I greeted her. "How's everything going?" She smiled weakly, but there was a sadness beneath the surface. "You know, same old, same old. But I've been thinking about what you said, about faith. I guess I never really understood it, but I'm starting to wonder if there's more to it than I thought." The words shocked me. "You've been thinking about it?" I asked. "What changed?" She shrugged, her eyes scanning the aisles as if trying to avoid the question. "I don't know. Just the way you've changed, Sarah. It's like you've found something I didn't know was possible. I don't know if I believe, but I'm curious." A part of me wanted to shout, to say that I knew the answer she was searching for, but I held back, knowing this was her journey, not mine to push. "Well, if you ever want to talk more about it, I'm here," I said softly. "I might take you up on that," she replied, her voice tentative but open. And then there was Emma, my daughter, who had begun to show more interest in the Bible at night. We'd started reading together, even if it was just a few verses each evening. It wasn't much, but I could feel something shifting in her, something quiet yet powerful. One evening, after reading a passage about Jesus calming the storm, Emma looked up at me, her face filled with wonder. "Mom, do you think God really can calm the storms in our lives?" I smiled at her, my heart full. "Yes, sweetie, I really do." As the days passed, I saw the ripple effect of my own transformation beginning to touch those around me. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't without struggle, but it was real. It was undeniable. The more I leaned into my faith, the more the relationships around me began to shift. Some, like Emma's, were tender and full of potential. Others, like Mark's, were fraught with tension. But in every connection, there was a thread of possibility, of change, of growth, and of hope. The road ahead wasn't clear, and I had no idea where it would lead. But one thing was certain: I couldn't walk it alone. I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully see, a precipice where everything I had built was about to fall apart or come together. Mark had stopped coming to church with me, and the silence between us had grown heavier with each passing day. I could feel the weight of my transformation pressing on him, on Emma, on everything I held dear. And the more I tried to explain, the more distant they became. It was one Sunday afternoon when the breaking point came. I had just returned from church, my heart full of peace after hearing the message of grace. But as I walked through the front door, the tension in the air was palpable. I knew something had happened, and my instincts told me it wasn't good. Mark was in the living room, pacing back and forth. His face was twisted in frustration, his hands clenched at his sides. When he saw me, his eyes flashed with anger, and my stomach dropped. "Where have you been?" he snapped. "Church," I replied softly, setting my purse down. "Mark, what's going on? I don't understand you anymore." His voice cracked, the emotion too much for him to hide. "You've completely changed, Sarah. You're not the woman I married. You're obsessed with this Jesus thing, and it's like I don't even know you." My heart ached at his words, but I didn't back down. "Mark, I haven't changed. Not in the way you think. I'm different. I've found something, and it's changing me from the inside out." "Changing you?" he scoffed. "You're turning into someone I can't even recognize. It's like I'm losing you." The hurt in his words stung, but beneath that, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Fear. Fear that he might be right. Fear that I was losing the person I loved, the life I had known. "You're not losing me," I said, my voice trembling, "but I can't go back to who I was. I'm asking you to see that." Mark took a step back, his face turning pale, as if the words I had spoken had just landed in a way he couldn't understand. "I don't know how to do that, Sarah. You're pulling away from me, from everything we built, and I don't know how to fix it." There was a long silence between us, both of us struggling to understand the other. I wanted to scream that I was still the same woman he had married, that I wasn't leaving him behind, but my words felt hollow, like a broken promise. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my heart shattering. "I never wanted this. I can't ignore what I know now. I can't go back to being that person who didn't know Jesus." At that moment, Emma walked in, her face drawn with worry. She had been listening at the door, and her presence only made the tension worse. "What's going on?" she asked softly. I looked at Mark, who was now pacing again, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "Everything's fine, honey," I said, trying to reassure her. But I knew it wasn't. It wasn't fine at all. Mark's voice cut through the air. "No, it's not fine. Your mom's changed. She's become someone I don't even know, and I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know how to live with it." Emma's eyes widened, her gaze flicking between us. "What do you mean, Dad?" Mark turned to her, his face pale, his voice strained. "It's like she's not the same person. She talks about Jesus all the time. She's distant. She's not the woman I married, and it's tearing us apart." I could feel Emma's eyes on me, but I couldn't look at her. I couldn't bear to see the disappointment in her eyes. The realization hit me all at once. I had failed her. In my pursuit of faith, I had neglected my family, and now I was losing them. "Mark, I'm still here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still your wife. I'm still Emma's mother. I'm not the same, and I don't know how to make you understand that." For a moment, it seemed like Mark might say something else, but instead he turned away, his back to me. He walked toward the door, grabbing his coat as he went. "I need space, Sarah. I can't do this right now." And just like that, he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stood there, tears welling in her eyes. "Mom, why is this happening?" she asked, her voice full of confusion and hurt. I didn't know how to answer her. How could I explain to my daughter that everything I had once known was being torn apart? That in my pursuit of truth, I had lost the people I loved most? "I don't know, Emma," I said softly, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I don't know how to fix this, but I know one thing. I won't stop loving you, and I won't stop praying that we'll find a way through this." But as the door closed behind Mark, a cold fear settled deep in my chest. What if we couldn't fix it? What if my faith had cost me everything? I couldn't allow myself to believe that. But in that moment, the weight of the choice I had made felt almost unbearable. The days that followed Mark's departure felt like a storm that never quite passed. He'd been gone for 2 weeks, and during that time, I tried to navigate the heaviness of our household without him. Emma had withdrawn, spending most of her time in her room, and I could see the pain in her eyes every time she looked at me. The distance between us was widening, and I wasn't sure how much further I could reach out without pushing her away completely. The silence between Mark and me was unbearable. I hadn't heard from him since he left, and though I wanted to call him, to reach across the divide, I couldn't bring myself to make that first move. I knew I was right in my beliefs, but I wasn't sure anymore if I was right in how I had handled everything. Had I been too focused on my faith? Had I abandoned the ones I loved in my pursuit of God? One afternoon, I was sitting in the living room, staring out the window, when I heard the sound of keys in the door. My heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment I thought maybe it was Mark. But when the door opened, it wasn't him, it was Lisa, standing there with a hesitant expression. "Mrs. Green?" she asked softly. I blinked, trying to pull myself together. "Lisa? What are you doing here?" She stepped inside, her voice barely audible. I wanted to talk to you. I've been thinking about what you said and about my own life. I don't know where else to turn." I stood up slowly, motioning for her to sit. "Of course, you can always talk to me, Lisa. What's on your mind?" She hesitated before speaking. "It's about my dad. I think he's really sick. And I'm scared. I don't know what to do. I know you said to pray, but I don't even know how to pray." In that moment, I felt a surge of compassion for Lisa. I realized that, just as I had been struggling with my own faith, she was also wrestling with questions of her own. She was facing her own version of turmoil, and I couldn't help but see the parallels. "Lisa," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "prayer is simple. It's not about knowing the right words. It's about speaking from your heart. Just ask God for peace, for help, and if you need to, I'll pray with you." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what I believe, Mrs. Green, but I'm scared. I just don't want to lose my dad." I reached out and placed my hand on hers, offering what little comfort I could. "You don't have to have it all figured out. Just start with what you know. God hears you, even when it feels like nothing's happening." She nodded, and after a long pause we prayed together, the words coming quietly but sincerely. I couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where my faith would bear fruit, not in the form of grand gestures, but in quiet, humble acts of compassion. As Lisa left, I felt a mixture of peace and uncertainty. My situation at home with Mark still loomed over me, and the strain between us seemed insurmountable. But I also knew something else. If I could help Lisa, if I could be there for her in her fear and confusion, perhaps I could find a way to reconcile with my own family. Later that night, I sat down with Emma again. The silence between us had become a constant ache in my chest, but I couldn't pretend anymore that everything was okay. I had to confront the truth with her, as painful as it might be. "Emma," I began, my voice thick with emotion, "I know I've been distant. I know things aren't the way they used to be, and I can see the pain in your eyes. I'm so sorry. But I need you to understand that I'm doing this because I believe it's the right path. I believe in Jesus, and that's changed everything for me." She didn't answer immediately, but I saw the conflict in her eyes, the same conflict I had been feeling inside. "I know it's hard," I continued, my voice breaking. "I'm not asking you to believe everything I do, but I need you to know that I love you. That will never change." She didn't speak, but after a long moment she hugged me tightly, and for the first time in weeks I felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't know if things with Mark would ever return to normal, and I didn't know if Emma would come to accept my faith, but in that moment, I knew I had made the right choice to stand firm. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but the path forward, though uncertain, was the only one I could walk. The days after my conversation with Emma felt like the calm before the storm. I had hoped that the small moment of reconciliation between us would be the beginning of healing, but deep down, I knew that healing wasn't going to come easily. The wound between Mark and me was too deep, and no amount of prayer or quiet faith could magically fix the rift. Still, I held on to the belief that somehow, through it all, God was with me, but life had a way of testing my faith in ways I never expected. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything came crashing down. I had just returned from a meeting at the church when I found a note on the kitchen counter. It was from Mark. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper, and my heart sank with every word I read. "Sarah, we need to talk. I'm not sure where we're headed anymore, but I can't keep pretending everything's fine. I need answers. I need you to explain this to me. I'm coming home tonight. Please, let's talk." I stared at the words, my mind racing. I had been waiting for this moment, the confrontation that would either tear us apart or put us back together. But even knowing it was coming, I wasn't prepared for it. I wasn't ready for the storm that was about to break. When Mark walked through the door that evening, it felt like the weight of the entire world was on my shoulders. His face was pale, his eyes tired. He looked like a man carrying a burden he wasn't sure how to unload. I could tell he had been thinking long and hard about what I had said, and whatever conclusions he had drawn had only made things harder. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but strained, "I've been thinking a lot about what you've been saying, and I don't know how to say this, but..." He paused, searching for the right words. "I'm not sure I believe any of it. What you found, what you're so sure of, it's just too much for me. I can't get my head around it." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I had always known that my faith was something that could drive a wedge between us, but hearing Mark's doubts out loud, seeing how deeply he was struggling, was something else entirely. I had to remind myself to breathe, to stay calm. "Mark," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I understand. I really do. It's not easy. I didn't expect you to just accept everything I believe overnight." He looked at me, his eyes dark with confusion and hurt. "But it's more than that, Sarah. You've changed. I don't know who you are anymore, and I don't think I can live with this version of you." I felt my heart shatter in my chest. I had been so focused on holding on to my faith, so convinced that God would make everything right, that I hadn't realized how deeply my transformation was affecting the people I loved, how much I was losing in the process. "Mark," I said again, this time more firmly, "I haven't changed, not in the way you think. I'm still the same woman who married you, who had a family with you, but I've found someone that's changed my heart in ways I can't explain. I don't expect you to understand it, but I need you to know that it's not about leaving you behind." His eyes softened for just a moment, but then the hardness returned. "I can't do this, Sarah. I don't know how to keep going like this. I don't know how to keep loving you when I don't recognize you anymore." I could feel the weight of his words sinking into me, deep into my bones. The life we had built was crumbling before my eyes. And in that moment, I understood the full cost of following Christ. The silence between us stretched out, thick and suffocating. I wanted to reach out, to take his hand, to tell him that we could work through this together. But the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure if this path would lead us back to each other, or if it would tear us apart forever. And then, in the quiet of the room, I heard a whisper, a voice that wasn't mine, but that seemed to speak directly to my soul. "Trust me." It wasn't an audible voice, but it was as clear as anything I had ever heard. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, I wasn't alone. I didn't have all the answers, but I had God, and that was enough. "Mark," I said, my voice steady now, "I know this isn't easy. I know this feels impossible, but I love you. I will never stop loving you, and I'm asking you to hold on, even if you don't understand." He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. But as he turned to walk away, a knot tightened in my chest. I knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but as I watched him go, I whispered a prayer in my heart. "God, help me. Help us." The following days after that conversation with Mark were a blur of emotions and uncertainty. The tension in the house felt unbearable, and I could hardly breathe without feeling the weight of everything that was hanging in the balance. It was as though we were both walking on a tightrope, each step fragile and unsure. I had spent so many hours praying, seeking God's guidance, but there was no clear answer. Mark was distant, and Emma, though still trying to hold on, was visibly shaken by the changes in our home. The pain of seeing my family torn apart by something I couldn't explain was almost too much to bear. How could I reconcile my faith with the people I loved most? How could I continue on this path when it felt like everything I had built was falling apart? It was on a cold, quiet evening when everything came to a head. Mark and I had barely spoken for days, and as I sat in the living room, I could feel the weight of the moment settling in. I knew he was going to leave soon. His heart was no longer here, and there was nothing I could say to make him stay. He had made up his mind, and the thought of losing him felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Then, just as I was preparing myself for the inevitable, Mark walked into the room. His face was pale, his eyes clouded with a storm of emotions. But something in the way he moved, the uncertainty in his steps, told me that he hadn't made peace with the decision he had been pushing towards. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice strained, "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending like I'm okay with everything. I know you believe what you believe, but I don't think I can follow you down this path. I feel like I'm losing myself." His words hit me like a ton of bricks, but what came next was the hardest part. His voice broke as he added, "I'm sorry, Sarah. I can't stay like this. I need to leave. I need to find myself again." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The air between us was thick with pain, and every word felt like a weight dragging us both down. I had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was the breaking point, the moment when everything I had fought for, everything I had hoped for, was slipping away. But as I looked at Mark, truly looked at him for the first time in what felt like ages, I felt something deep inside me shift. The love I had for him was still there, undeniable and strong, but I also realized something else. I wasn't the same woman who had first met him. I had changed, yes, but that change didn't mean I had to abandon everything I had ever known about love and family. God had transformed my heart, but that didn't mean I had to let go of my family. I could love them, even if they didn't understand my journey. "Mark," I whispered, my voice shaking but determined. "I love you. I always have, but I can't stop following Jesus, and I won't make you follow me. But I need you to know this. I will always love you, no matter what. Even if you choose to walk away, I'll still be here, and I'll keep praying for you. I won't give up on you." The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Mark didn't speak, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was torn, and I knew that he wasn't leaving because he wanted to. He was leaving because he didn't know how to reconcile the man he had been with, the man he was becoming, or not becoming. He couldn't find the bridge between his old life and the new one I had found in Christ. I walked toward him slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. "You don't have to have all the answers, Mark. You don't have to figure everything out today, but I can't keep pretending like we're okay when we're not. You have to decide, and whatever you choose, I will respect it. But you also need to know that I'll never stop loving you." Mark stood still, his face pale, his lips trembling as if he was on the verge of breaking. And then, almost as if guided by something outside himself, he spoke. "Sarah, I don't know how to explain this. I don't know what to say, but I'm scared. I don't know who I am anymore." I took a deep breath, stepping closer, until I was just a few inches away from him. "That's okay, Mark. I don't have all the answers either, but God does. And right now, I know that He's asking me to trust Him with you, with our family." It was in that moment, with those words, that something shifted between us. I didn't know what the future held, whether Mark would walk away for good or whether God would work in his heart in a way I couldn't understand. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I knew I had done everything I could. I had loved, I had prayed, and I had trusted. Whatever happened next, I was at peace with the path I had chosen. Even if the road ahead was uncertain, I knew I wasn't alone. I had Jesus, and with that, I could face whatever came next. The days that followed the emotional showdown with Mark felt like a slow, steady release, a deep breath after holding it in for far too long. Life didn't return to normal immediately, nor did I expect it to. Mark's decision, whatever it was, had yet to be fully realized. I had no control over his heart, no way to make him understand what had so radically changed me. But what I did have, what I could control, was my own response to the path I had chosen. In the weeks that followed, I found a new sense of peace, peace that I had never expected to feel in the midst of so much uncertainty. The quiet moments at home became spaces for reflection, prayer, and growth. I had learned that following Jesus wasn't about erasing all the pain and struggle in my life. It was about learning to trust God, even when the outcome was unclear. It was about accepting that my journey might be lonely at times, but knowing that I would never walk it alone. I could feel the change in myself, though it wasn't immediate. I noticed it first in how I responded to others, how my patience grew, how my love seemed to flow even more freely. There were still days when the weight of everything felt too heavy, when I would cry out to God, asking for strength, for guidance. But I had a new understanding of grace, the grace that had been extended to me and the grace I was now called to extend to others, especially to Mark. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table looking out at the fading sunlight, Emma came to me. Her face, still full of youthful wonder, now had a maturity that mirrored her own spiritual growth. She sat beside me, her hand resting gently on mine. "Mom," she said softly, "I've been thinking about what you said, about how you don't give up on us, no matter what." She paused, as if gathering her words. "I think I'm starting to get it. I think I'm starting to understand that faith is more than just about believing. It's about loving. And no matter what happens with Dad, I know you're going to love him. And I think that's what God wants from all of us." Her words, so simple yet so profound, struck me deeply. In the midst of my own turmoil, in the midst of losing so much, I had gained something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of what it meant to love without conditions, without limits. God had used the hardest moments of my life to teach me this. Mark and I still weren't whole. Our marriage was still fragile, held together by threads of love, prayer, and a shared hope that one day the rift between us would heal. I didn't know when or how that healing would come, but I had learned to trust God with the timing. And even more so, I had learned to trust Him with my own heart. As I lay in bed that night, the soft sound of Emma's breathing filling the room, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had found a purpose in this painful journey, a purpose I never could have imagined before. God had led me to a place of spiritual awakening, of redemption, and of hope. And no matter where this road led, I knew I wasn't walking it alone. I thought about the story of the prodigal son, how the father waited for his son to return, never giving up hope, always ready to embrace him when he came home. I realized that God's love for me, for Mark, for all of us was the same, unconditional, patient, and eternal. And as I lay there, I whispered a prayer, one of gratitude for the journey I had walked and for the journey that still lay ahead. God, thank you for this journey. Thank you for your grace, for your never-ending love. No matter what happens next, I trust you. I will continue to walk, even when the road is hard, because I know you are with me. As the story comes to a close, I invite you to reflect on your own journey, your own struggles and moments of transformation. How has your faith shaped your life? And how might God be calling you to embrace love and grace in your own relationships? If this story has inspired you, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, share this message with someone who might need it, and continue seeking the hope that comes from walking with God.